last week you mentioned that there are many theories, many visions of how to raise children. Amongst modern approaches, what do you see as their current strengths and weaknesses?
So we could dissect anything in this way, strengths and weaknesses. Really though, the usefulness is to, if we're a parent or an educator, if we're a parent, to discover the truthfulness, is what I was speaking about last week. Discover the truthfulness here. This that's living the life, this that's supporting our children to flourish, this that is open-hearted. And this points us to what's healthful for our children. Because different children, as all human beings, have different needs. The form, the life, the physicality, the interests, the family and cultural situations and beliefs, so different schooling approaches will be useful and not useful for individual cases. If we're looking more generally as a whole, and as you know, with all of my children have attended Steiner schools and I've trained and worked in Steiner education, that points to an underlying spiritual aspect and connection of the divinity of the children. It points us as adults, parents and educators to inquire deeply, who are we? Who are we? How are we being? How are we acting? As I said last week, not just in front of the children, in our whole life, because that's what we're bringing to the children, who we are. So that particular education system supports that. It supports the healthy nourishing of the physical body, so awareness around food and diet and medicine, protective qualities of the developing child, what's appropriate at different ages and stages. So rather than me getting into this is right and this is wrong with all kinds of different education systems, because there will be some wonderful teachers, wonderful systems, wonderful benefits in lots of the different systems. For me, there's a very holistic approach with Steiner education and Rudolf Steiner's insights, and that's something that is alive in our life and in our home and in our community and with the children. And so whilst that I mentioned that deep spiritual aspect, it might not be spoken about directly to the children, and yet that quality informs and supports and holds the education system. And so the teachers are all on a path of self-inquiry and self-development that's deeply spiritual and deeply nourishing. So they're nourished, and so are the children that they're on this journey with. Did you want to ask any more about that question specifically? Like, was there something particular that you wanted spoken about?
I guess I was thinking of my own education, and how that's quite limited at school, that it's mainly a general knowledge type of education, really, and had very little relevance to life apart from general knowledge.
Yeah.
So that I would say it's very limited, my experience of school education.
Yeah. So this is where we can see, as a parent, if we are willing to be really present here and inquire here about who am I and what's driving and living this life, then we can see why we may be drawn to certain types or styles. I think you mentioned the word styles of education. So if we have a fear in us that drives us, that we have to be successful, and maybe we were or maybe we weren't, we might want that then for our children, and so we might go along a path that values academic knowledge above anything else. It may be that the physicality and the sport and being able to move the body, it may even be a similar driving force to be successful, but rather than in an intellectual way, it may be in a more physical way. Now, there are different people that these educations suit. So the physical nature, so then you may have this drive to have your children educated in a system that values sport and competition and athletics, that type of system. Or when you hear the word spirituality, you might come from a deeply religious family, culture, background. And so you might want that those values are paramount. And so then you send your children to a school that's either culturally appropriate. There are German schools and Armenian schools, and there are, all kinds of schools that are cultural schools, Japanese schools. And there are also religious schools. So we know there are Catholic schools and Church of England schools and Protestant schools, and all around the world there are all different types of schooling that support the religious aspect. So for me in my life, it's about the holistic flourishing of the whole human being, that the child is developing and growing, not just to be an academic, not just to be financially successful, but to be a free thinking, purposeful, connected, spiritually aware human being, flourishing, compassionate, creative. One of the things about Steiner education is that there's a huge emphasis on creativity, and often that's overlooked or dismissed because it's seen as creative arts. The thing is, as human being, if we're creative, we can come up with ideas and innovations and solutions that might not have presented themselves if we just have a linear thought. So the artistic approach opens up the individual. So it's part of that education system of educating the whole child, the physical, the mental, the spiritual, all of it, the emotional.
Sounds really good for autistic people.
For
artistic people.
Artistic people? Did you say artistic or autistic?
Autistic.
Autistic.
Yeah, because often they're very limited, able in a very limited sphere, very able.
Yeah.
I would think.
So there are autism. It's called a spectrum disorder, and so there's a huge range within that. And some of the children have such incredibly high needs; they need one-on-one support. Some children can flourish in any school setting. Some need support in a school setting. We actually have a Steiner schooling for children with all kinds of disabilities in Sydney. So the Warra Farm and the schooling attached to that. And around the world, you know, the Steiner schooling, and Rudolf Steiner was a spiritual scientist, and education is one aspect that he gave insight about. He gave insight about biodynamic farming, so agriculture and farming practices that were healthful to the food and the land and the human beings and the animals that would be part of that. Medicine, anthroposophical medicine. So the spiritual aspect and the nurturing of the whole human being, and the education system. So it's not just education. When I speak of Steiner schooling, it's actually it encompasses. That's why it's such a wholesome education system. And you know, some people might not desire that for their children. So that's why it's not about, just this one, and this is good in here and bad in here. You know, we have to trust this that's trustworthy, living our life and guiding us, and the ruthless willingness to see what is it that's driving us, so the truthfulness can come through and shine through.
That's good.